I think that, at the federal level, they can incentivize more investment in their local recycling sector, like the domestic recycling sector within the US. But I think at the same time, this is an area where states and local governments really need to step up, which is challenging in some ways, but it's also empowering for citizens, I think, because you're much more likely to be able to influence local policy and state policy. And I think this is kind of an under-leveraged group of policymakers when we think about what we should do. A lot of people are really familiar with the importance of writing their US congressman, but state and local policymakers make really important decisions about our environmental, health, and social justice issues, and recognizing those roles, I think, is critical and empowering.
Welcome to the official podcast of the Journal of Science Policy and Governance. In this podcast, students and early career researchers share more about their publication in the journal. Join us weekly to hear from the next generation of STEM leaders as we elevate their voices in science, technology, and innovation policy. Welcome, and thank you for joining us for this episode of SciPol SoundBites, a podcast of the Journal of Science Policy and Governance. I'm Adriana Bankston, JSPG's Chief Outreach Officer and your host for this podcast. Today, we continue with episodes from the joint issue between JSPG and the AAAS Science and Technology Fellowships Program. Authors who are interviewing today are discussing important topics around workplace wellness, commercialization, and recycling, and their different publications. So let's talk a little bit about each publication. We'll start with Hannah-Kaye Fleming is a JD student at the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law at Arizona State University. Hannah-Kaye will graduate in May 2021 and will begin her legal career as a clerk at the U.S. Bankruptcy Court. Hannah-Kaye is interested in the range of legal issues, from bankruptcy to the intersection of healthcare, science, technology, and policy. The white paper published in JSPG by Hannah-Kaye is entitled Navigating Workplace Wellness Programs in the Age of Technology and Big Data. So Hannah, tell us a little bit more about your publication.
Yeah, thank you for having me today. So my publication focused on workplace wellness programs and how they're so common in many corporations, and many employers are adopting them. But it kind of takes a unique twist and talks about how the incorporation of wearable technologies like Fitbits and Apple Watches in these types of programs present additional challenges for employers. And so my paper analyzed a couple issues relating to, first, inadequate privacy regulations. So unlike the European Union, the USA doesn't have a federal privacy law that applies to everyone. We have more of piecemeal legislation when it comes to privacy. And so this often doesn't protect the average consumer's data that is collected through these wearable devices. The other issue that my paper looked at was the data security protections, which kind of goes with privacy. So when there is a privacy breach with maybe the data that your Fitbit or Apple Watch is collecting, it's hard for consumers to really have any real recourse because of the lack of legal ability to challenge those issues. And so I analyzed first these privacy and security issues, and then the paper kind of goes into more ethical concerns with employers adopting wellness programs that incorporate these technologies. Because of the lack of privacy and data security, there's concerns that if mismanaged, there could be potential negative implications for employees in the workplace. For example, when an employer has all of the employees' health data, from how many steps did they take on Monday to how many steps they took on Tuesday, it's possible that this information can create personal biases that maybe could hinder someone's ability to get a promotion or things of that nature. So my paper proposes that because of the lack of legal clarity around these issues and how fast technology changes, it's almost impossible for the law to always keep up with those changes. And scholars refer to this issue as the pacing problem. And so my paper encourages employers and corporations to follow standard best practices when it comes to data and security. And some of these are just making sure, one, that the program that they incorporate is actually voluntary. A lot of the workplace wellness programs are tied to incentives. And so employees don't have to participate, but maybe participating gives them 30% off on their health insurance. And so it's kind of hard to say no if the incentive is really high. So I think that's important for employers to make sure that they're balancing the incentive level to make sure that the program is voluntary, and that employees who don't feel comfortable with sharing all that information or participating in the program aren't penalized. And then the other thing is that I think it's really important to know, if you're contracting with Fitbit or Apple for these wearable devices, to make sure that the companies that you contract with have good data and privacy protections in place. And I feel like most tech companies are focusing on this, but I think it's also important for the employer or the corporation who's implementing the program to make sure that they also have systems in place, whether that be hiring a chief data and privacy security officer, or setting up their technology so that it's not going to be misused. And the other thing that, some of the best practices that I touched on was just the need for data transparency between the employee who's participating in the program and the employer, because, a lot of times people without the tech background or legal background may not really know what they're, signing up for or waiving when they agree to be in the program. And so I think it's important for the employees to know what can possibly happen with their data, how is the data going to be used, where does the data go, and those type of questions. But yeah, that kind of sums up what my research was about. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Yeah, that brings up a lot of thoughts. I think this is a very timely topic. I think a lot of people are using these. And I was curious if you can talk a little bit more about the best practices, because I'm curious what exists in companies that's working that could be adopted more widely. Are there a few things that would be helpful? And also related to that, is this dependent on the discipline? So when you talk about corporations, is healthcare different from other types of companies?
Right. So your first question, there's a broad range of different best practices when it comes to data and security. A lot of those kind of go around making sure that you have secure systems, data systems and management systems to make sure that, outside breachers can't break into the system, basically. When it comes to the different type of companies, so kind of, again, I think there's a range of companies that are adopting these programs, not just healthcare companies. I know there's law firms who also offer wellness programs to their employees. And I think even Walmart was doing a program with their employees, encouraging them to sign up to be a part of the wellness program and lower their premiums. The issue comes in with data and privacy is, depending on how they're contracting these programs, they may not be protected by the data and security laws that we have right now in place in the United States. So for example, if you're contracting with a healthcare company who is getting the healthcare data from the Apple Watch or the Fitbit, they will usually be governed under HIPAA, and that's a law that really prevents healthcare data privacy breaches. But if you say the company is contracting with just Fitbit, well, Fitbit isn't considered a healthcare company, and maybe the company, like say Costco contracts with Fitbit, Costco's not going to fall under HIPAA as well. So at that point, then you don't really have a secure federal legislation regulating that relationship.
Great. Yeah, that's really interesting. So one other thing I was thinking of, because I don't know all the background of how this works, is when thinking about the question of access. So is everybody in the company able to access these technologies, or are some people that are less able to, and does that create any kind of inequities?
So from my research, I've claimed that most companies who are using workplace wellness programs that have this technology edge to it are giving their employees the Fitbit. They're not, it's kind of like another carrot of participating in the program, is that you get the Fitbit that helps you track your steps and keep up with, you know, your daily exercise goals.
Great, that's really helpful. Okay, thank you. That was really interesting. So we'll move on to Anna Zolyniak. She's a senior studying international politics with a concentration in international law, institutions, and ethics at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. Currently working at the National Academy of Sciences, Anya is interested in the need to reform legal frameworks and policies in order to account for emerging and non-traditional national and international security threats, such as climate change. The policy analysis published in JSPG by Anya is entitled RIAC, Responsible and Informed Arctic Commercialization, A Way Forward. So can you explain a little bit to our viewers about what Arctic commercialization is and what your memo is addressing?
Sure, so I'll take the first part of that, that two-part question, and kind of explain what's happening when we do say and talk about Arctic commercialization. And within that phrase, you know, most people have a kind of conceptualization about what commercialization is, right? What commercialization looks like and commercial development. So the important part of that phrase is the first part, right? The Arctic. And that's for a number of reasons. The first is that the Arctic is not a place that the United States in particular, but really a lot of different other countries, even, you know, countries that have territory in the Arctic, have really paid attention to a lot. You know, there's no Arctic specific treaty like there is in Antarctica. You know, we have a treaty for space, and we've had, you know, different conventions about space, whereas the Arctic for now is still largely governed by like UNCLOS and already established legal regimes. And the United States oftentimes, you know, doesn't really act like it is an actual Arctic power. You know, the notion of we have this territory in Alaska, that is, you know, a section of it is above the 66.5 line of latitude, but a lot of people don't even recognize that the United States is an Arctic country. Now, that's one part of it. The second part is that the Arctic is changing at such a rapid pace that individuals who actually study the Arctic have lost the ability to actually categorize and describe what's happening. So when we talk about Arctic development, it creates a problem because, one, you don't have established statutes and established regulations that account for the specific and unique qualities of the Arctic, the you know, the low temperatures, the specific types of ocean currents, the specific types of ecology. But you also don't have a way to account for the changes that are happening, right? So not only do you have very different biome in the Arctic that isn't really accounted for in different types of regulations, but that biome is drastically changing every day. And NOAA just recently, earlier this month, released their 2020 Arctic report, which they've been doing since, I believe, 2008, and marked the 2019 to 2020 was the second warmest year on record after 2016. And every year you see reductions in sea ice coverage. Every year you see rising temperatures, changes in precipitation patterns. You see increasing wildlife populations. So bowhead whales have been increasing due to increased algal productivity because of increasing ocean temperatures. And that changes the game of what we need to understand and consider when making policies for the Arctic. Now, while you're having all these changes occurring, you're also having companies that are saying, wow, there's a reduction in sea ice. Now that we can actually access the Arctic, let's try to get our hands on the resources that are there. Earlier last month, the Trump administration made a push to sell oil rights in ANWR, which is the Arctic National wildlife refuge. So you're seeing this kind of very complex amalgamation of characters that are at play in the Arctic, where the government is trying to say, okay, now we have a kind of issue because there are so many changes happening that we need to account for. You have business interests where you're saying, okay, we have access now because the sea ice is melting, so we can, you know, put in oil tankers and bring in cruise ships and what have you, bring in drilling equipment, bring in shipping, and create shipping lines for cargo. And then you have the actual Americans who are living in the Arctic, who are suffering through the different kinds of changes without really help or assistance from the government. So when we talk about what Arctic commercial development looks like, it looks like business interests that are going into a region that really doesn't have a framework for regulation and that is literally seeing groundbreaking changes every single day. What do we do about it? Well, for starters, you know, there's always big connection back to climate change and what an individual can do. But it's really, in my opinion, it's an area that Washington needs to recognize and reassert itself, not just, oh, the United States is an Arctic power where we have, you know, power contestation with Russia and increasing Chinese interest, but to say that we have Americans living in the Arctic and how are they influenced by what's happening. So it's not much that I think we can do, you know, speaking as private citizens, other than lobbying the government and bringing this as an issue, and making sure our representatives know that, you know, you're not just representing the people in the continental United States. There are people up there, and recognizing that. But I think in terms of what the United States can do to kind of broach this issue is to reassert itself and say, okay, climate change isn't just affecting people, you know, on the coast in Louisiana, in Texas, and Florida. It's not just affecting the stock market that was flooded during Sandy. It's affecting, you know, individuals who might not have the villages that they live in the next 10 years because of coastal erosion up above the Arctic Circle.
All right, thank you for explaining that. Yeah, I think this is an interesting topic. I didn't know a lot about it before hearing from you, and you did really well explaining it. It seems like there's a lot of different dimensions here. Like you mentioned, different groups involved who are regulating this. It sounds like there's a federal component. I'm also wondering if you think there's any state level regulations that need to happen in addition.
Yeah, and that's 100% something that I think the Alaskan government has been trying to do. And there's also the vital importance of recognizing the rights of Alaskan Natives and making sure that they have a seat at the table, but that seat at the table isn't, you know, here, you know, sit here so we can include you in a photo shoot, but is actually like, let us hear your voices and what's important to you. So it is federal level regulations in terms of, you know, how we can modify the CFR for like different shipping purposes and different regulations for the EPA, DOD, and what other interests there could be. But the people who know the Arctic are going to be the people that live there, right? So it is engaging with the state level and local representatives that really know the issues and can really vocalize what they're seeing, what's happening. And it's also engaging with the Alaskan Natives who are living in a lot of the settled regions in the Arctic. Because once you broach, you know, up in the north and you get to Ukdiavik and you get to a lot of the settlements up there, most of them are majoritarily Alaskan Native. So it is also engaging that local component.
Thank you. So we'll move on to Erin. Erin Murphy is a PhD candidate in the Biology and Society program at Arizona State. She studies the impacts of plastic pollution on marine ecosystems and researches the efficacy, costs, and trade-offs of different intervention strategies to identify the best policy solutions. Currently, she is working in the Philippines and Hawaii. After completing her PhD, she hopes to work at the nexus of research and policy at a non-governmental organization, federal agency, or intergovernmental organization. The policy memo, published in JSPG by Erin and co-authors, is entitled Policy Recommendations to Reinvigorate Recycling in Arizona. So Erin, tell us a little bit more about your publication, please.
Yeah, of course, and thank you for having me. a lot of people have heard about China's national sword policy that was passed in 2018 in some form or another. The main takeaway from that policy is that China actually banned the import of a lot of recyclable waste from the United States. And there's been a lot of media coverage about what that means for recycling in the US. And we see, a lot of cities are no longer recycling, and this has become a really big area of concern. But because recycling is really a local issue and state level issue, because that's where waste is managed, we wanted to get a better understanding of what was happening in our state and look at if there was any local or state level policies that could be implemented to help kind of remove some of the stress that China's ban has placed on local recycling programs. And so for our memo, we ended up interviewing municipalities from across the state. So we spoke with their recycling coordinators, and it was really important to us to get a representation of a breadth of counties, because Arizona has these large metro areas such as Phoenix, of course, and also like Tucson and Flagstaff. But then we have a lot of counties that have really small populations that are spread out. And one of the biggest challenges with recycling is transportation. And so the issues that, Yuma County or smaller counties in Arizona are going to face will be very different than what we'd see in Phoenix. And so ultimately we had interviews from 12 of the 15 counties in Arizona. And from these interviews, we wanted to identify key challenges that these programs are facing, but also opportunities that they saw for recycling in the future. One of the things that everyone spoke to us about was how the market's changed since 2018 when China implemented this ban. And the main thing is reduced profits. So China imported the majority of American recyclables. It was especially important for plastics and for mixed papers. And losing that market, the United States just doesn't have the infrastructure to collect all of the recyclables that we're domestically creating. And so different municipalities weren't able to find buyers for some of their products that used to be very valuable. So things like mixed paper, which they could sell to China for $100 or $200 a ton. Now they're selling it to other international markets for $5 to $10 a ton. And this has shifted profits in some case by like $1 million for a city annually. So it's really substantial changes in profits. And then the other thing is we just see municipalities that can't even find companies to buy their products. And so some of these smaller towns are, and you hear about this even in bigger cities across the US, filling up these storage facilities with recyclables, waiting to find a company that's willing to buy their products. And that's not even necessarily for a net profit. So this was really interesting to see that these policies that are affecting national recycling are also affecting Arizona. But there were a few challenges that most recycling coordinators mentioned that were state specific as well. One of the most important ones is with state level legislation. And so there are two Arizona statutes that are really important for this, 49836 and 49837. The first one establishes a landfill disposal fee. So for every ton of material that is disposed of in a landfill in Arizona, the municipalities or companies who drop off that material are required to pay a 25-cent tax to the city or to the state. But that other statute that's in partnership with this actually approves a recycling grant fund. And so half of that 25 cents is supposed to go to the Arizona Department of Environmental Quality and actually create a grant program that funnels that money back into recycling programs at the municipal level. So municipalities are paying this tax to the state to help the state create this recycling program or recycling grant program that then allows them to invest in their recycling programs. And the use of this fund was really broad. So it was over $17 million went through this fund from 91 to 2009, and it allowed people to build landfills, start their curbside recycling programs, buy equipment, do research and development to find new cost-effective ways to recycle, a lot of really important projects. However, since 2009, the state has zeroed out this fund and diverted these funds to other uses. So they're sweeping this money into the general fund, but the municipalities are still paying this landfill tax. And so they're paying money to the state that's supposed to help them with the recycling programs, and they're not seeing that come back to them. And so this has been devastating, especially for some of the smaller cities, because they can't necessarily afford the really high initial investment costs of recycling programs, such as building a new landfill. It's really expensive. Another really specific challenge for recycling coordinators in Arizona is this notorious ban on bans, as people call it. And so a few cities started implementing bans on plastic bags at the municipal level. And the state actually responded by passing a law that prohibits municipalities from implementing any sort of policy about recycling auxiliary containers. And the language there is very broad. And the implications of having really broad language like that is not only that now cities can't implement bag bans or bag taxes or straw bans or any of these things that we see happening in other states. Like, we see that in California, for instance, there's many municipalities who have those kinds of policies, but it actually prohibits cities from even having recycling mandates, requiring apartment complexes to offer recycling. Anything related to the management, use, or disposal of those products is prohibited from municipalities from regulating. And so as a result, this has actually had a really negative impact on municipalities, because a lot of people think of these policies as purely environmental issues, but these are also issues of cost and feasibility for recycling centers. Things like plastic bags are very bad for recycling facilities. When they get in the machines, they'll clog the machines and shut down entire facilities for hours while they're cleaning those bags out. And recycling is also an economy of scale issue. So the more material you have, the cheaper it becomes to process that material. And by the state implementing these policies, they're actually making it much harder for municipalities to make their recycling programs cost effective. And the results of this has been that every municipality we talked to had to either raise the prices of their programs, cut services so they recycle less types of products, or cut their programs altogether. And this is really devastating for, first of all, Arizonans like recycling. They want these programs to continue, but it also has environmental and economic implications, and even social and social justice implications as well. However, despite these challenges, I do think that the recycling coordinators also outlined some opportunities. Like I said, there's this gap in the market that China's created. And one of the benefits of that is that now domestic companies can come and fill that gap. So we are seeing companies in the US starting to build recycling processing plants locally and recycle these materials. And they feel that some investment in the recycling sector locally could actually encourage businesses to come in and start building up this recycling sector in the state of Arizona. And so based on these interviews, we came up with 3 main policy recommendations. So we wrote a policy memo, so this was addressed to the Arizona State Legislature specifically. The first is to refinance that recycling fund fully and to stop divesting from it and sweeping those funds into the general fund. The second is to repeal that ban on bans, or the prohibition on regulations for auxiliary containers. And then the final one is to create incentive programs to encourage companies that either process recycled materials or use recycled materials that are from the state of Arizona to come here, so that we can see this build up of local industry.
Great, thanks. That was a lot of useful information. I have a lot of questions. Trying to keep to a couple. So one thing, so you mentioned that this is directed to state level legislation. You also mentioned environmental issues and transportation. Do you think that federal agencies should be involved in, for example, Transportation Department or EPA? Have you thought about that and how they might address this or help the local issues?
Yeah, it's a really challenging issue because basically the federal government recognizes they have to manage municipal solid waste, but then they put that responsibility on the states, and then the states put that responsibility on municipalities. And so I think there are really important things that are already being done at the federal level, such as regulations on leachates from landfills, for instance. So we have to make sure that landfills meet very strict, water quality standards, and that there's testing and monitoring and things like that. We see efforts to address areas where waste management has failed, maybe where there's like hazardous waste dumps and things like that. The federal government comes in and, there's the Superfund site program. So they invest in cleaning up these areas and stuff. But I think that, at the federal level, they can incentivize more more investment in the local recycling sector, like the domestic recycling sector within the US. But I think at the same time, this is an area where states and local governments really need to step up, which is challenging in some ways, but it's also empowering for citizens, I think, because you're much more likely to be able to influence local policy and state policy. And I think this is kind of an under-leveraged group of policymakers when we think about what we should do. You know, a lot of people are really familiar with the importance of writing their US congressman, but state and local policymakers make really important decisions about our environmental health and social justice issues, and recognizing those roles, I think, is critical and empowering.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And I'm also curious about, so statewide specifically, so it seems like there's a lot of differences between different areas, but potentially different states as well. So I'm wondering if there's something that is working in other states that could be adopted. Have you done that kind of research?
Yeah, so that is something that we're really interested in. I'm actually now the policy chair for the Arizona Recycling Coalition. And so I'm working with these recycling coordinators now to actually advocate to state legislators. And one of the most compelling things is what's happening in other states. We are working with Colorado's recycling coalition as well, because Colorado is more similar to Arizona. I mean, I would unfortunately say Arizona's kind of a step behind. There's a lot of examples of how bag bans can reduce the cost of municipal recycling by removing these things that are expensive to manage for a city. Like in California, there's many municipalities that have passed laws like that. Boulder just passed a law like that as well. But because cities can't even start to implement these things, there are a lot of examples, I guess, from that end. Like further down there, so there are cities and states that are making even more proactive steps to mitigate like plastic pollution and better manage waste, such as Honolulu just passed a ban on all single-use plastics that's going to go into place in 2022. So we'll definitely be watching things like that closely to look at the environmental benefits of that type of policy and also the cost effectiveness. But I think unfortunately Arizona is a few steps behind some of these other states, and so we're just trying to focus on getting rid of some of the prohibitive legislation we have at first, and then just getting money back into these programs that is being divested.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And you brought up a lot of kind of good overall principles of policymaking. So going back to this, and I think this is relevant to all three of you, what does good policymaking look like in your topic? If you specifically for students who want to get involved in this, how can they do that, and what does that mean for them to develop good policies in your areas?
Yeah, so I think the most important thing to recognize is that good policy, and I think Anya said this perfectly, but like good policy really should include all stakeholder groups. You look at something like waste management, and a lot of people think of that as an environmental issue, but it also really is a social justice issue. Landfills, hazardous waste centers, incinerators, they're all built in marginalized communities. And so bringing these people to the table is important. Understanding why what different stakeholders kind of have in that, like why they care and what their priorities are is the first step for good policy making. I think as a student coming in, finding out what organizations are already working in the space and having a good grasp of what policy levers exist is important, because as an early career scientist, you have ideas of you can really understand the science and the implications and the causation of like what is happening from something, right, and from a scientific lens. But there are going to be organizations that are already working and have institutional strengths that if you partner with them, then you're more likely to take the science that you understand and be able to implement that and turn that into good policy. And then the final thing I think is really important is making sure that a policy, you really understand if it's going to be effective in achieving the goal or objective you started with, and what's the cost of that policy, and what are the trade-offs or maybe unexpected consequences of that policy. And a really simple example, I think, for plastic pollution is we can push for things like regulation of plastic water bottles. That's something that pretty much everyone agrees isn't deemed necessary. However, there's many places in the US where people still don't have access to clean drinking water. And so if you push for an environmental policy such as that at like a national level and don't think about places like we saw Flint very recently, where people can't even drink their local water and this may be their only source of clean water, it's really important to think about these different kind of potential consequences of the policy to make sure that it is not only good for achieving your objectives, but in line with your broader goals for like the society you want to live in.
If I could just jump off of Erin's point on that. First of all, congratulations on your chair position. That's awesome that you are able to really be doing so much in the field that you seem very passionate about. Going kind of in the counter of what Erin was saying about how, as a young scientist, you have all these ideas, but really understanding what the policy levers are. I personally am not trained in the sciences. I'm more trained on the policy side of it. So for me, I would say what good policy is to understand that there is a scientific foundation, and to not be afraid of that scientific foundation, but to embrace it and really try to get informed rather than trying to create policies, within kind of closed doors behind, whether it be in the House of Representatives or in a state house or what have you, to integrate the knowledge that exists in the scientific community about a specific issue. And obviously I do understand that not everything is going to have, a foundation in biology or chemistry or physics or what have you, but in the issues that do, like climate change, it is so critical to listen and hear and understand, comprehensively understand the science that is coming out of that community. And partially what I talk about in my memo is that need to support the community and understand that you can't just say, okay, like we're gonna, give all this money to NOAA and have it channeled into specific things, but that each specific focus area within a specific type of science needs additional funding, needs expertise, needs an understanding. So I think on the policy side of it, like Erin was saying, where scientists need to understand the policy side of it, the policy people need to understand the science of it. And that's not to say that everyone needs to have, basic grounding in basic science, but the willingness to hear and the willingness to learn from others, I think, is critical. And I would also just add on something that Erin said too at the end, about the complexities of a lot of these issues, right? It's oftentimes very attractive to slap on a solution. You say like, okay, like we have, the issue of Arctic commercialization, so let's just ban shipping or something like that. But that doesn't really deal with the complexities of it, because another big issue is the lack of economic development that you're seeing in a lot of Alaska Native communities. So the notion of bringing in more money into these communities is something that's very, very attractive to them and that they potentially would still be interested in. So it's not, trying to take the easy way out of a lot of these issues, but to understand how they're all kind of complexly interrelated. And then another example, as Erin was saying, in a lot of Alaskan communities, on the one side, they have this impending, essentially, doom of, lack of the changing migration patterns of a lot of the wildlife that they rely on for food are changing. And you have some coastal communities that are, like I said before, within a decade could no longer exist due to coastal erosion. On the other hand, they rely on cheap fossil fuel energy to heat their homes. And that's not something that they're, I don't want to speak for them, of course, but based on my understanding, that's not something that they're very, very eager to give up very easily. So a lot of these issues are very complexly interrelated, and it is important to take a kind of systems approach to these issues instead of just focusing on something in isolation in a box, because it's easier.
Yeah, definitely agree. I think that's a really interesting perspective. I'm glad you brought up sort of the flip side of that. Thank you. So we'll finish up with Hannah, if you have some comments on this question too.
Yeah, well, I agree with the statements that both of the panelists have already mentioned, and I think they raise really good points. I think with my topic, especially, good policy starts with being more consumer focused and looking at, okay, in the employee-employer context, what what type of program is good for the employee and the employee's health, and creating that program and making sure the technology that you're using in the program is focused more on the employee than the corporation.
Yeah, that's a really important point too. And I think all of these can be applicable to a number of issues. So it's really interesting to hear all of your points. Thank you. Great, so we'll wrap up. So thank you to our guests today, and thank you to everyone for joining us. You can find this episode and others like it on JSPG's YouTube channel and on SoundCloud. And that's it for this week on SciPol SoundBites, the podcast of the Journal of Science Policy and Governance.
If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to our podcast on YouTube and SoundCloud. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at SciPol Journal.